The frozen breath of winter hung heavy over the Ardennes forest on the morning of December 16, 1944. Staff Sergeant William Henderson crouched in his foxhole, watching the mist roll through the pine trees like ghostly fingers. The silence was unnatural, almost oppressive. For weeks, the American forces had grown comfortable in what they called the Ghost Front, a quiet sector where green troops came to get their first taste of combat and battle-weary veterans came. To rest, Henderson adjusted his rifle strap and glanced at his watch. 0530 hours, something felt wrong. The veteran of Normandy had learned to trust his instincts, and every fiber of his being screamed danger. The 106th Infantry Division had been holding this line for barely a month. But the eerie calm had lulled many into a false sense of security. Across the German border, just 8 miles away, a massive force was stirring in the darkness. Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp, was about to unleash hell upon the unsuspecting Americans. 3 German armies, the 5th Panzer Army, the 6th Panzer Army, and the 7th Army, totaling over 200,000 men, were poised to strike. The plan was audacious in its scope and desperation. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had protracted against the operation, calling it a damn fool enterprise, but the Führer's will was absolute. The German forces would punch through the lightly defended Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and drive northwest to Antwerp, effectively cutting off the British 21st Army Group and the American 1st and 9th Armies from their supplies. Colonel Joachim Peiper, commanding the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, checked his Tiger tanks one final time. His battle group, known as Kampftruppe Peiper, was spearheading the advance of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. The young colonel's reputation for ruthless efficiency had been earned on the Eastern Front, and now he would test American resolve. As referenced in historian Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive analysis of the battle. The German offensive represented Hitler's final attempt to achieve a decisive victory in the West and potentially force a negotiated peace with the Western Allies. Back in the American lines, Private First Class Robert Wagner huddled deeper in his coat. The 28th Infantry Division had been holding the southern portion of the Ardennes sector, spread impossibly thin across a 25-mile front. Wagner, barely 19 and fresh from Pennsylvania, had joined his unit just 3 weeks earlier. The other soldiers assured him this was a quiet sector, a place where nothing ever happened. The deception had been masterful. For weeks, German forces had moved only at night, camouflaging their positions during the day. Radio silence was maintained religiously. Dummy radio traffic was broadcast from other sectors to mislead Allied intelligence. Even the weather seemed to conspire with the Germans. Heavy cloud cover had prevented Allied reconnaissance flights from detecting the massive buildup. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, had dismissed intelligence reports suggesting German concentrations in the Ardennes. The prevailing wisdom held that the Germans were finished, their forces scattered and demoralized after the disasters of Normandy and Falaise. How wrong they would prove to be as dawn approached. On that fateful December morning, the largest artillery barrage on the Western Front since D-Day was about to shatter the morning calm. The Battle of the Bulge, so named for the distinctive bulge it would create in the Allied lines, was about to begin, and it would prove to be the bloodiest single battle fought by American forces in the entire Second World War. At exactly 0-5-30 hours on December 16, 1944, the earth itself seemed to convulse. From Monchaux in the north to Echternach in the south, an 85-mile front erupted in thunderous violence as over 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The barrage was so intense that soldiers 50 miles away felt the ground tremble beneath their feet. Sergeant Henderson was thrown from his foxhole by the first salvo. Shell after shell screamed overhead, exploding in the forest canopy and sending deadly splinters of wood and metal raining down on the American positions. The carefully prepared German fire plan was devastating in its precision. Communication lines were severed, command posts obliterated, and supply routes blocked by fallen trees and debris. In the village of Lanzareth, Lieutenant Lyle Boak and his intelligence and reconnaissance platoon watched in horror as searchlights illuminated the morning fog, creating an otherworldly backdrop for the advancing German infantry. The 18 men of the platoon found themselves facing the entire 9th Parachute Regiment, over 3,000 enemy soldiers. The German assault came in waves. Following the artillery barrage, elite Fallschirmjäger paratroopers advanced through the forest, their white winter camouflage making them nearly invisible against the snow-covered ground. Behind them came the tanks, massive Tiger II heavy tanks and Panther mediums, their tracks churning the frozen earth as they pushed deeper into American territory. Colonel Piper's battle group smashed through the thin American lines like a hammer through glass. His lead elements captured the village of Hansfeld before most of the American defenders even realized they were under attack. The surprise was so complete that German tanks rolled past American soldiers still in their sleeping bags, some never waking from their final slumber. Private Wagner and his squad found themselves cut off and surrounded within the first hour of the attack. The 7th Army's advance had overrun their positions near the Our River, and now they faced a desperate choice: surrender or attempt to escape through enemy-held territory. Wagner chose to fight, joining a growing stream of American soldiers who were forming ad hoc defensive positions wherever they could find cover. The German plan was unfolding with terrifying efficiency. The 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, had achieved several breakthrough points along the Our River. The 6th Panzer Army, under SS Oberfuhrer Joseph Dietrich, was pushing hard toward the key road junction of St. Vith. Most critical of all, Piper's spearhead was racing toward the Meuse River crossings, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. American communications were in chaos. The 106th Infantry Division's command post had been overrun, and Divisional Commander Major General Alan Jones had lost contact with 2 of his regiments. Confused and contradictory reports flooded into headquarters at Spa, where 1st Army Commander Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges struggled to understand the scope of the German offensive. The weather proved to be Germany's greatest ally. Thick clouds and fog prevented Allied aircraft from taking to the skies, neutralizing one of America's greatest advantages. Without air support, American ground forces faced the full fury of the German assault with little hope of reinforcement or resupply. By noon, the German advance had penetrated up to 6 miles into American territory at several points. Entire units had simply vanished, their fate unknown to higher command. The road networks that were crucial to American logistics were falling into German hands one by one, threatening to collapse the entire defensive position. In the town of St. Vith, Brigadier General Bruce Clark arrived to find chaos and confusion. The vital road junction was under threat from multiple directions, and American forces were streaming back in disorder. Clark immediately began organizing a defense, knowing that holding St. Vith was crucial to preventing a complete German breakthrough. The first day of the Battle of the Bulge had been a stunning German success. Hitler's gamble appeared to be paying off as American forces reeled back in confusion and panic. But scattered across the Ardennes, small groups of American soldiers were beginning to coalesce into centers of resistance that would prove far more stubborn than the Germans had anticipated. The morning of December 17th brought no respite for the beleaguered American forces. If anything, the German pressure intensified as Panzer spearheads exploited their initial breakthroughs. But scattered across the frozen landscape, pockets of American resistance were beginning to coalesce into something approaching organized defense. At the crossroads town of Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe was hastily organizing the defense of what would become the most famous siege of the war. The 101st Airborne Division, still recovering from their costly victory at Operation Market Garden in Holland, had been rushed forward to hold this vital junction. Without Bastion's road network, the German advance would be severely hampered. Mick Auliffe, a veteran artillery officer known for his unflappable demeanor, surveyed the town's defenses with growing concern. His paratroopers were spread thin around the perimeter, facing German forces that outnumbered them by nearly 3-1. Worse still, the division's heavy equipment had been left behind in the hasty deployment, leaving the defenders critically short of anti-tank weapons. Meanwhile, Colonel Paper's battle group continued its relentless advance toward the Meuse River. The SS officer had covered nearly 30 miles in the first day, but his progress was slowing as American resistance stiffened. Near the village of Malmedy, Piper's column encountered a convoy of American vehicles from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. What happened next would become one of the war's most notorious atrocities. After capturing 84 American prisoners, Piper's men herded them into a field near the crossroads. Without warning, machine guns opened fire, cutting down the defenseless soldiers in the snow. Those who survived the initial burst were systematically executed with pistol shots to the head. Only a handful escaped to tell the tale of what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. News of the massacre spread rapidly through American lines, transforming shock and confusion into cold fury. The rules of engagement changed overnight. German prisoners became a rarity as American soldiers sought revenge for their murdered comrades. The battle had taken on a new, savage dimension that would characterize the fighting for the remainder of the campaign. In the village of St. Vith, General Clark's hastily assembled defense was coming under increasing pressure. The 7th Armored Division had arrived just in time to prevent the town's immediate capture, but German forces were massing for what appeared to be a decisive assault. The defenders knew that every hour they held St. Vith was precious time for American reinforcements to arrive. Lieutenant Boke's reconnaissance platoon had performed miracles at Lanzereth, holding off an entire German regiment for nearly 18 hours before finally being overrun. Their sacrifice had disrupted the German timetable and allowed other units to establish defensive positions. Though captured, Boke and his men had proven that American soldiers, properly led and motivated, could stand against impossible odds. As detailed in Charles MacDonald's authoritative account, A Time for Trumpets, the German offensive's initial success began to slow as American commanders adapted to the crisis and rushed reinforcements forward from across the European theater. Weather remained Germany's ally, but it was a double-edged sword. While Allied aircraft remained grounded, German supply lines were also struggling in the harsh conditions. Piper's spearhead was beginning to outrun its fuel supplies, and promised airdrops of gasoline failed to materialize due to the same weather that grounded Allied planes. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, was quick to recognize the crisis for what it was, not just a local German attack, but a major offensive that threatened to split the Allied armies. From his headquarters in Versailles, he ordered immediate reinforcements to the Ardennes sector. The 82nd and 101st Airborne divisions were pulled from their rest areas and rushed to the battle zone. Perhaps most significantly, Eisenhower made the decision to transfer operational control of American forces north of the German penetration to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. This controversial move would later cause political friction, but it ensured unified command during the crisis and freed up American commanders to focus on containing the southern shoulder of the German advance. By the end of the second day, the German offensive had created a dangerous bulge in them, Allied lines extending nearly 25 miles into American territory. But the rapid advance was beginning to expose the operation's fundamental weakness: insufficient fuel and supplies to sustain such an ambitious operation against determined resistance. December 18th, dawned gray and bitter cold, with temperatures plummeting well below freezing. In the encircled town of Bastogne, General McAuliffe's paratroopers were settling in for what they knew would be a desperate siege. The German ring around the town had tightened during the night, cutting the last remaining supply routes and trapping the 101st Airborne Division inside the perimeter. The defense of Bastogne had become a race against time. McAuliffe commanded approximately 11,000 men, including elements of the 10th Armored Division and various artillery units that had been caught in the rapid German advance. Against them, General von Luttwitz's 47th Panzer Corps was massing for what the German commander believed would be a swift capture of the vital road junction. Inside the town, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Medical supplies were running critically low, and the division surgeon, Major Douglas Davidson, was performing operations by candlelight in the basement of a bombed church. Ammunition was being rationed, with each soldier allotted a specific number of rounds for their rifles. Most critically, food supplies were dwindling, and the men were already on half rations. The German bombardment was constant and merciless. Artillery shells whistled overhead every few minutes, exploding in the narrow streets and sending clouds of debris and smoke rolling through the town. The distinctive whine of German Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, dubbed screaming Mimis, by American soldiers, added to the psychological pressure on the defenders. Staff Sergeant Henderson, who had managed to fight his way back to friendly lines after the initial German assault, found himself assigned to the defense of the northern perimeter. His squad occupied positions in the ruins of a farmhouse just outside the town proper, with orders to hold at all costs. The veteran NCO had seen enough combat to know that their situation was desperate, but he also knew that giving up Bastogne would hand the Germans a decisive victory. On the morning of December 22nd, a German delegation approached the American lines under a white flag. The officer, Major Wagner von der Heydt, carried an ultimatum from General von Luttwitz demanding the immediate surrender of the garrison. The terms were stark: surrender honorably or face complete annihilation. When the German message was delivered to McAuliffe, the general's response became legendary. After reading the formal surrender demand, McAuliffe reportedly exclaimed, "Nuts!" His staff officers suggested that the Germans might not understand American slang, so the official written response was slightly more diplomatic, but equally defiant. To the German commander, "Nuts," the American commander. The German reaction to this rejection was swift and violent. Artillery fire intensified, and infantry attacks began probing the American perimeter from multiple directions. The 5th Parachute Division launched a determined assault against the northeastern sector, while elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division attacked from the southeast. Meanwhile, Piper's battle group had finally been halted just short of the Meuse River. Fuel shortages and determined American resistance had brought the SS Spearhead to a standstill near the village of Stoumont. American forces, including elements of the 3rd Armored Division and the 82nd Airborne Division, had surrounded Piper's column, trapping nearly 800 German soldiers behind enemy lines. The weather, which had favored the Germans for the first 6 days of the offensive, was finally beginning to clear. On December 23rd, the clouds parted for the first time since the battle began, allowing Allied aircraft to take to the skies. The results were immediate and devastating. Thunderbolt fighter bombers and Flying Fortress heavy bombers appeared over the battlefield, attacking German supply columns and troop concentrations with deadly precision. For the defenders of Bastogne, the sight of Allied aircraft overhead was like a gift from heaven. More importantly, transport planes began dropping desperately needed supplies into the shrinking perimeter. Parachutes carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and food began falling from the sky, many landing directly in the town square, where they were quickly distributed to the combat units. The air resupply operation was not without cost. German anti-aircraft fire was intense, and several transport planes were shot down. But the psychological effect on both sides was enormous. The Americans realized they had not been abandoned, while the Germans understood that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. General George Patton's Third Army was racing north from the Saar region, having executed one of the most remarkable military maneuvers of the war. Patton had wheeled 3 entire divisions through 90 degrees and was driving toward Bastogne with characteristic aggressiveness. His lead elements were already engaging German forces south of the town, fighting to break through the encirclement. Christmas Day, 1944, brought no peace to the frozen battlefields of the Ardennes. Inside the besieged perimeter of Bastogne, General McAuliffe's paratroopers celebrated the holiday with rations and the occasional sip of liberated German schnapps. The sound of artillery fire had become so constant that many soldiers had learned to sleep through all but the closest explosions. The German assault on Christmas morning was their most determined yet. General von Ludwitz had concentrated his remaining armor for one final push, convinced that the American defenders were on the verge of collapse. Tiger tanks of the 103rd SS Heavy Tank Battalion led the attack, their massive guns blazing as they approached the northwestern edge of the perimeter. Sergeant Henderson's squad found themselves directly in the path of the German assault. With no anti-tank weapons heavier than bazookas, the Americans were forced to rely on courage and improvisation. Henderson personally knocked out a Panzer IV with a well-placed bazooka round, but the cost was terrible. Half his squad fell in the space of 10 minutes, cut down by machine gun fire from the supporting German infantry. The fighting was savage and desperate. American paratroopers engaged German tanks at point-blank range, sometimes leaping onto the vehicles to drop grenades through open hatches. The town streets ran red with blood from both sides, and the acrid smell of cordite and burning diesel. Fuel filled the air, but unknown to the German attackers, relief was less than 5 miles away. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, had been fighting his way north through determined German resistance for 3 days. Patton had given him explicit orders: reach Bastogne or die trying. At 4:50 in the afternoon, Abrams' lead tank, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess, broke through the final German defensive lines south of Bastogne. The Sherman tank, its gun barrel trained on German positions ahead, rumbled into the town's perimeter to the cheers of exhausted paratroopers. The siege of Bastogne was broken after 7 days of hell. The relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for the German offensive, but the fighting was far from over. Hitler, convinced that victory was still possible, ordered his forces to hold their gains at all costs. The result was some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire war, as American forces began their counteroffensive to eliminate the Bulge in their lines. Colonel Piper's battle group, cut off and surrounded near Stoumont, made a desperate attempt to break out on Christmas night. Abandoning their heavy equipment and wounded comrades, the surviving SS troops attempted to infiltrate back to German lines on foot through the snow-covered forests. Many were killed or captured, but Piper himself managed to escape, though his elite unit had been effectively destroyed. As referenced in historian John Eisenhower's detailed study, The Bitter Woods, the failure to capture Bastogne marked the operational failure of the entire German offensive, as the road junction remained in American hands and prevented the Germans from securing their supply lines. The weather had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. Clear skies allowed continuous air attacks on German positions, while transport planes dropped supplies to American units across the battlefield. The Luftwaffe made a desperate attempt to regain air superiority with Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945, but the attack failed catastrophically, costing the Germans over 200 irreplaceable aircraft and pilots. Private Wagner, who had spent 2 weeks fighting as part of various ad hoc units, finally rejoined the remnants of his original company near the town of Wiltz. The young soldier had aged years in the space of days, his boyish face now bearing the 1,000-yard stare of a combat veteran. He had seen friends die, had killed German soldiers at close range, and had learned that war was nothing like the movies he had watched back home in Pennsylvania. The German offensive was now clearly failing. Fuel shortages had become critical, with many panzer units abandoning their vehicles for lack of gasoline. German infantry, exhausted by weeks of continuous combat in sub-zero temperatures, were beginning to surrender in increasing numbers. The Wehrmacht's last reserve had been committed and found wanting. General Bradley, initially caught off guard by the German offensive, was now coordinating a massive counterattack designed to not just restore the original lines, but to destroy the German forces trapped in the Bulge. The First and Third Armies were converging from north and south, while Montgomery's forces prepared to strike from the west. The cost of the battle was becoming apparent. American casualties were mounting toward 100,000 killed, wounded, and missing, the highest single battle toll of the war. But German losses were equally severe, and unlike the Americans, Germany could not replace its losses. The flower of the Wehrmacht and Waffens lay frozen in the Ardennes snow, never to fight again. The first week of January, 1945, brought a bitter cold that seemed to penetrate even the thickest winter clothing. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, turning the battlefield into a frozen wasteland where frostbite claimed as many casualties as enemy bullets. But for the trapped German forces in the Ardennes salient, the weather was the least of their problems. General Eisenhower's counteroffensive began in earnest on January 3rd. The plan was elegantly simple in concept but brutally difficult in execution. The First Army, under General Hodges, would attack south from the northern shoulder of the Bulge, while Patton's Third Army drove north from Bastogne. If successful, the converging attacks would trap the remaining German forces in a pocket from which there would be no escape. The fighting was unlike anything the war had seen. German resistance was fanatical, as SS and Wehrmacht units fought with the desperation of cornered animals. Every village became a fortress, every farmhouse a bunker. American forces found themselves paying in blood for every mile of frozen ground as they slowly compressed the German salient. Staff Sergeant Henderson, now commanding what remained of his original squad, plus several replacements, led his men in the attack on the village of Huffelise. The small Belgian town sat astride the main German supply route, and its capture would effectively cut the salient in half. But the German defenders, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, had turned every building into a strongpoint. The assault began at dawn with a thunderous artillery barrage that turned the town center into a moonscape of rubble and smoke. Henderson's infantry followed the barrage closely, running across open ground swept by machine gun fire from German positions in the church tower and surrounding buildings. The veteran sergeant made it to the town square before a sniper's bullet shattered his left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him behind the fountain that marked the village center. As Henderson lay bleeding in the snow, he watched his men continue the attack with grim determination. These were no longer the green recruits who had been caught off guard in December. They were hardened combat veterans who had learned their trade in the crucible of the Ardennes. Private Wagner, now acting as squad leader after the loss of 2 corporals, led the final assault on the church with textbook precision. The capture of Huffelise on January 16th marked a turning point in the battle. American forces from the north and south finally linked up, trapping thousands of German soldiers in the rapidly shrinking pocket. But the trapped Germans continued to fight with remarkable tenacity, knowing that every hour they held was another hour for their comrades to escape across the German border. The human cost of the battle was staggering. Field hospitals overflowed with casualties from both sides, and the frozen ground made burial impossible. Bodies were stacked like cordwood in temporary morgues, waiting for the spring thaw to allow proper interment. Medical personnel worked around the clock in conditions that would have challenged peacetime hospitals, performing surgery by lamplight in bombed-out buildings. German morale was finally beginning to crack under the relentless pressure. Units that had fought with fanatical determination for weeks were beginning to surrender en masse as their ammunition ran out and their positions became untenable. The sight of American Thunderbolt fighter bombers prowling the skies unopposed was particularly demoralizing for German troops, who remembered the Luftwaffe's earlier dominance. Hitler's reaction to the failing offensive was predictably furious. The Führer blamed his generals for the defeat, refusing to acknowledge that the plan had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. He ordered the remaining German forces to hold their positions to the last man, but his field commanders were increasingly ignoring such impossible directives in favor of saving what remained of their units. The weather began to moderate in late January, bringing the first thaw since the battle began. The result was catastrophic for military operations as roads turned into rivers of mud and tracked vehicles became mired in the frozen muck. Supply operations, difficult enough in the bitter cold, became nearly impossible as trucks and tanks struggled through the morass. For the German forces, the thaw was particularly devastating. Already short of fuel and ammunition, German units found their remaining vehicles trapped in the mud, easy targets for American artillery and air attacks. Withdrawal became a race against time as American forces closed in from three directions. The end was now clearly in sight. German forces were streaming back across their own border in disorder, abandoning equipment and supplies in their haste to escape the closing trap. The great gamble had failed, and with it went Germany's last hope of achieving anything resembling victory in the West. Private Wagner, now wearing sergeant's stripes earned in the blood and snow of the Ardennes, looked back at the battlefield one last time before his unit moved forward in pursuit of the retreating Germans. The frozen landscape was littered with the debris of war, burned-out tanks, abandoned equipment, and the graves of friends who would never see home again. The young soldier had entered the battle as a boy and emerged as a man, forever changed by what he had witnessed in the forests of Belgium. February 7, 1945, marked the official end of the Battle of the Bulge as the last German forces withdrew across the Our River to their original starting positions. What had begun as Hitler's last desperate gamble to change the course of the war had ended in complete failure, costing Germany its final strategic reserve and hastening the end of the Third Reich. The statistics told the story of one of the war's bloodiest battles. American casualties totaled over 89,000 killed, wounded, and missing, making it the costliest single engagement for United States forces in the entire Second World War. German losses were equally severe, over 100,000 casualties, including many of their most experienced officers and NCOs who could never be replaced. Staff Sergeant Henderson, recovering from his wounds in a field hospital near Luxembourg City, reflected on the battle that had claimed so many of his friends. The bullet that had shattered his shoulder in Huffelei's had ended his war, but he considered himself lucky. Too many good men lay buried in the frozen soil of the Ardennes, their sacrifice ensuring that democracy would survive another dark hour in human history. The strategic implications of the German defeat were enormous. The failure of Operation Watch on the Rhine had consumed Germany's last mobile reserves, leaving the Western Front virtually defenseless. American and British forces were already preparing for the final push across the Rhine River, while in the east, Soviet armies were advancing inexorably toward Berlin. The war's end was now a matter of months, not years. For the American military, the Battle of the Bulge had been a painful but necessary education in modern warfare. The initial shock and confusion had given way to remarkable resilience and adaptability. Units that had been scattered and demoralized in the opening Days had regrouped and fought with a determination that surprised even their enemies. The citizen soldiers of the United States had proven they could stand against the best the Wehrmacht could throw at them. General Eisenhower's leadership during the crisis had been masterful. His decision to place American forces under British command temporarily had prevented the crisis from becoming a complete disaster, while his rapid deployment of strategic reserves had contained the German advance. Most importantly, his refusal to panic had steadied the entire Allied command structure during the darkest hours of the battle. The personal stories emerging from the battle were tales of extraordinary heroism and sacrifice. Lieutenant Lyle Boke and his reconnaissance platoon had held off an entire German regiment for 18 crucial hours. The defenders of Bastogne had defied impossible odds to hold their vital crossroads. Countless unnamed soldiers had performed acts of courage that would never be officially recognized, but had collectively turned the tide of battle. Private Wagner, now Sergeant Wagner, was among the American forces crossing the Rhine River in March. The young soldier who had cowered in a foxhole during the opening German barrage was now a seasoned combat leader, responsible for the lives of 12 men in his squad. The transformation was remarkable but typical of thousands of American soldiers who had found strength they never knew they possessed. The German military machine, once seemingly invincible, was finally showing signs of complete collapse. The Luftwaffe had been effectively destroyed, the Kriegsmarine reduced to a few isolated submarines, and the Wehrmacht was falling back on all fronts. The men who had conquered most of Europe were now defending the approaches to their own capital, their confidence shattered by the failure in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge had also demonstrated the decisive importance of air power in modern warfare. Once the weather cleared and Allied aircraft could operate, the outcome was never really in doubt. German supply columns were decimated, troop movements disrupted, and communication severed by the constant air attacks. The lesson would not be lost on military planners in future conflicts. As spring arrived in the Ardennes, the scars of battle were slowly healing. Belgian farmers were already beginning to clear the debris from their fields, and life was slowly returning to the devastated villages. But the memories of that terrible winter would linger forever, memories of courage and sacrifice, of friends lost and freedoms preserved. The Battle of the Bulge stands as a testament to the resilience of free peoples when confronted with tyranny. Against overwhelming odds, outnumbered and surprised, American forces had stood firm and ultimately prevailed. Their victory had not come cheaply, but it had ensured that the light of liberty would continue to shine in a world threatened by darkness. In the final analysis, Hitler's last gamble had achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than splitting the Western Allies and forcing a negotiated peace, it had accelerated Germany's defeat and demonstrated to the world the ultimate futility of fascist aggression. The Battle of the Bulge was truly the last great German offensive of the Second World War, and its failure marked the beginning of the end for the Thousand-Year Reich.